Good afternoon. And for those of you who haven't been here, welcome to the Naval Academy Museum. Some of you probably haven't been here since the plebe year, so we'll try to correct that. But welcome. This is our regular Shifley lectures, and this is our last one for this semester. We've been holding them for 18 months, and we do so courtesy of the generosity of Vice Admiral Shifley and his wife and the class of 1950. Our distinguished guest today is Captain Bobbie Scholley. Sorry, Cap. I knew I was going to. Captain Scholley retired from the United States Navy in 2005 after over 24 years of service. Commissioned in 1981, she served as one of the early women in the surface warfare community before crossing over to the Special Operations community as a diving and salvage officer. She was the commanding officer at USS Bolster ARS-38 in 1992, becoming the fourth woman to take command of a Navy ship. Captain Scholley had key leadership roles in many Navy diving operations, including the TWA Flight 800 recovery in 1996, the USS Cole bombing recovery in 2000, and USS Monitor expeditions 2001-2002. Captain Scholley also served as commanding officer of Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2 in 2000 and Naval Weapons Station Earl, New Jersey in 2002. Captain Scholley has an MS in National Resource Strategies, holds an honorary doctorate of science from Illinois State University, where she's also inducted into their Hall of Fame. And she was recently seen on both CNN and Fox News as a diving subject matter expert during the Malaysian Airlines 370 search and the South Korean ferry capsizing tragedies. Captain Scholley, welcome. We are looking forward to your talk. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Clyde. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, and I'd like to thank the class of 1950 for their continued support of the Shifley lecture series. It's only fitting that we are here honoring Admiral Shifley, especially considering we're getting so close to Veterans Day. It's very appropriate that we should be telling this sea story about how these brave men and women conducted this operation to not only bring back a piece of naval history, but also to bring back some of our shipmates, our sailors and shipmates. And since we are getting close to Veterans Day, which is just around the corner, I would like to take just a moment. I think it's always appropriate to recognize our veterans, and I can tell that we have a few veterans here in the audience. So I would like our veterans here in the audience to please stand and be recognized this morning. And thank them for coming today too. But I'm also very thrilled to see all these midshipmen here, because quite honestly, you are the ones that I'm like to talk to today. And a show of hands, I'm just doing this because I really, really want to know. I am a special operations officer, although now that community is called the EOD community. And a show of hands for anybody who is interested in going EOD. Hoo-yah! It's a little bit tough, but it is well worth it, and it is a career opportunity that I found after almost 25 years in the Navy to be a fabulous career. And I'm going to tell you a sea story about one of those operations that I had the honor to be involved in. But I'm going to tell you about that sea story, but I'm going to start in the near history on it. Just about a year and a half ago, I had the honor and privilege to attend a memorial service and an induction ceremony right here in Arlington National Cemetery for a couple sailors that I really didn't know, but I actually met. And those were two sailors from the USS Monitor that we inducted into Arlington National Ceremony in 2013. And these sailors were given full military honors and buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Secretary Mabus presided over the ceremony, and it was an amazing ceremony. They were buried between the main mast, the USS main mast memorial, and the amphitheater, and a stone was erected that was dedicated to all 16 sailors that lost their life when the USS Monitor went down on that fateful night. But let's go back over 152 years ago, where this story begins. Now, I'm going to have to do a little bit of a cop-out here because I'm not a historian. There happens to be some very, very talented historians in the audience today. I see one back there in the back. So I am not going to try to compete with the historians. Hopefully, if you get an opportunity to listen to Dr. Craig Simon sometimes, they will tell you the full story of the history of the Monitor. But Monitor was built back in 1862, and it was an amazing ship. For those of you who have heard the story of the Monitor, there was the, of course, Battle of Hampton Roads in March of 1862 between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. You'll see on my slide that I'm trying to be politically correct here and say that that battle was a draw. Okay, when I give this presentation in Virginia, a lot of people will disagree with me when I say that battle was a draw. But for purposes of my presentation, that battle was a draw. But everybody here in this audience knows that that battle changed the course of naval warfare. And that is why I'm standing here today and talking to you about the Monitor. Unfortunately, the Monitor had a very short history. The Monitor sank off the coast of North Carolina in December of 1862 when the USS Rhode Island was towing her down to Beaufort, North Carolina. And she sank and lost 16 of her crewmen. What I found very interesting when I was doing some of the research and when I was talking to the historians, was that there were 5 Medal of Honors given to the crew of the Rhode Island for their efforts in trying to save the crew of the Monitor. And so it was a heroic effort, and they tried to get as many of the crew off, but 16 crew members were still missing when they recovered as many as they could. So the significance of the Monitor, as you can see, was huge. She was designed by a very interesting engineer. Now, I'm not an engineer. How many engineers in the audience do we have? Nobody's going to admit? Okay, there we go. We have one brave soul back there. Engineers are fabulous. I'm not an engineer. I had some amazing engineers working for me. Otherwise, this would never have happened back in 2002. John Erickson was a brilliant engineer, maybe a little bit on the difficult side, but he was brilliant. He designed the Monitor, and especially that revolving gun turret and that steam engine that we also recovered 2 years earlier and brought back to the surface. And the Monitor was not the only one. There were 66 Monitor class ships that were either in service or under construction by the end of the Civil War. But there were no Monitor class ships left that we had in a museum or left to show to the country or to evaluate or to research. So trying to get the USS Monitor back was something that historians and researchers had been doing for years. And there were a lot of people looking for the Monitor. And if you wanted to go back and read about how many people had been searching for the Monitor, there are several fabulous stories about the efforts that had been taken over the years to find the Monitor. I say very simply, the Monitor was discovered in 1973. There's an amazing book, and I'm going to tell you about several. As I mentioned earlier, I am not a writer, I'm a diver. And there's several amazing books. John Broadwater, who is one of the men who worked with us on the Monitor expedition, wrote a great book about this entire process of finding the Monitor and bringing the gun turret to the surface. He wrote the story about how that happened, and that is a great read if you ever want to get into the details further than what I'm talking about. Several people were looking for the Monitor, including, for you midshipmen if you don't realize it, a group of midshipmen in 1973 went out to Cape Hatteras and had planned to make a recreational dive to look for the Monitor. Now, I don't know for sure whether they were with the Scuba Club or whether they were with the Oceanographic Department. You're going to have to talk to Dr. Simon Simons and find that out or read the book. But they were headed out to find the Monitor. So I would say that in some ways it's because of the Naval Academy midshipmen that I'm even here talking to you today. But there were also several other groups looking for the Monitor. There was a group from Duke University, and the midshipmen actually started a process that got the Navy interested in looking for the Monitor. The Monitor was finally discovered, and they realized that they had the Monitor in 1973, and they announced it in 1974. We have finally found the Monitor. And she was found off the coast of Cape Hatteras in about 240 feet of water. How many of you are in the scuba club? How many of you have ever dove deeper than 100 feet? 120? Yeah, I hope not. Maybe 130. Okay, except for those three gentlemen right there. And they've maybe dove to 240 because they're from the Navy dive locker across the river. So 240 is a technical dive. So that poses a lot of challenges when it comes to diving and to salvage operations. And there are some recreational dives that are made on to Monitor. So NOAA had to come up with a plan. NOAA is the administrator of the Monitor Marine Sanctuary. Monitor became the first National Marine Sanctuary, and they are preserving the Monitor because it is a national treasure. And they had to come up with a plan, though, because Monitor was starting to deteriorate. And they soon realized that Monitor, the reason it was so hard to find, had sunk and was upside down, and that gun turret had slid off and was at an angle, and that's why it didn't look like they expected when they found it with the underwater pictures that they had found. So the Navy also became involved in this whole process of what are we going to do with the Monitor, how are we going to preserve her, and how are we going to bring back the important parts that we want to bring back of Monitor. And eventually that's how I got involved. And today I'm just going to talk to you about 2002, which was the last major expedition that we made on Monitor. And the reason that's the last expedition is because it's very expensive to do deep ocean salvage like that. We ultimately had to get some funding, and that funding came from the Department of Defense legacy funds, which Captain Chris Murray, at the time he was the commanding officer at Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2, the command that I ultimately took, became the commanding officer of, and that's the command that had the divers that did the work on this operation. He was able to go to Congress with the director of the Monitor Marine Sanctuary, Dr. John Broadwater, and they went to Congress and were able to get the funding to do this operation over a period of 3 years. And that culminated in 2002 with us being able to recover the gun turret, which I'm going to talk about today. We also had previously in 2000 been able to recover the steam engine, which was the other large artifact that NOAA and the Mariners Museum had decided that they really would like to get back and preserve and put on display for the country to be able to see. So a partnership was formed to put this all together. And the partnership was, of course, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. They were the keepers of the Monitor Marine Sanctuary. They were the ones in charge of preserving this natural treasure as it sat there on the ocean bottom. And they needed to preserve it, and they needed to decide how they would keep it safe and what would come back. But we needed somebody who would take those artifacts when we brought them to the surface and take care of them and display them so that everybody in the country and the world would be able to have access to them. So the people that Congress decided would be the appropriate people to do that would be the Mariners Museum, located in Newport News, Virginia. They had the facilities, they had the expertise, and they would be the appropriate people to take care of the artifacts. And they would be the other partners. And then the third partner in this team would be the US Navy. They had the expertise and the people to go out and recover the artifacts, and to go out also and dive on the Monitor and figure out how to preserve the Monitor so that we could stop the deterioration. Because again, Monitor was upside down, and just the effects of the environment were starting to cause the deterioration to accelerate. And we didn't want it to turn into just a pile of rubble before it had to. And then we were able to get the funding to do all of this. So in 2002, the team had to go back out and actually recover the gun turret. At this point, we had been out there 3 summers in a row. Now, we have some oceanographers in the audience here, right? Does anybody know what happens off the coast of Cape Hatteras in August, September? What are we worried about? Hurricanes, yes. Very good. And then what are we worried about in the winter and the spring in off the coast of Cape Hatteras? Winter storms. So we have a period of time off of Cape Hatteras between late May, early June, and the end of August when we could actually dive off Cape Hatteras. After all, they don't call Cape Hatteras the graveyard of the Atlantic for no good reason. So we had a window of about 45 days that we were able to actually dive over the site of the Monitor. And that's not a lot of time to do a deep ocean salvage job at 240 feet. So we had to do all of our planning over the winter months before we got out there. And we needed to have the plan in place, have all of our people in place, have our team in place, have our money in place, and make sure we were ready to go. We also had to have specialized equipment because we were diving in deep water. The Navy has their equipment that we do most of our work in, but we also have gone, the military has gone to a system where we don't necessarily have the equipment that we need for all of our operations sitting in warehouses all the time. We do what we call commercial owned, government operated equipment. And that is what we used in a lot of cases for this operation. We needed a barge with a crane that would lift this gun turret off the bottom. So we rented the barge Wotan from a company down in Louisiana that normally operates in the oil fields. And that is the platform that we utilized for 45 days off the coast of Cape Hatteras. That became our home. Now, you guys understand that when a Navy goes out on an operation, they go out on an operation. They go out for 45 days and they stay out for 45 days and they stay out for 45 nights. Well, when I talk sometimes to other groups and give this presentation, I have to explain that to people. We don't go out and we drive our boat out to the barge at 8 o'clock in the morning and then we quit at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and then we come in at night. We go out and we operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 45 days. So we stayed on that barge and we had to put some extra vans on that barge for berthing vans so we had enough room for our divers because we had about 120 divers on there at one time. So we had to put extra, we called them berthing vans, but they were not necessarily comfortable. So we were out there for a long time. This is our expedition team. You can see here we had the U.S. Navy divers. We had our salvage contractor, which is Phoenix International. They're somebody that we use for a lot of our salvage operations for some technical support. We had the barge, the Gulf barge Wotan. We had Global Industries because we were utilizing a commercial saturation system, and I'll get to that in a minute. We had NOAA, who was out there for technical support and to make sure that we did not break their national marine sanctuary. They were actually, Dr. John Broadwater is who I considered my boss out there on the operation. And we had the Mariners Museum because they had archaeologists, they had historians, and they had technical experts out there to make sure that we were doing this properly. Because quite honestly, this was an archaeological dig. And guess what? We're Navy divers. We're not archaeologists. And I see a couple guys back there smiling. Because you know what we do as Navy divers? We go down, we wrap a wire around a piece of stuff, a piece of junk on the bottom, and we yank it to the surface. That's the way we operate. And the archaeologists and the historians said, no, Captain Scholley, you can't go down and wrap that stuff around and just yank it to the surface. This is a 150-year-old precious piece of history. So they were there to keep us honest and make sure we were, you know, handling it very gently. And that was good because we needed to be kept honest when we were down there. And you know how they did that? I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. But we had cameras on our helmets the entire time we were operating on the bottom and diving, and they were on the surface, and they were following us every time we did something, and you'll see that in a minute, and making sure that it was like Big Brother was watching us every time we did something down there, and that was a good thing. So this is the team. You can see here in the team the gentleman in the hard hat. That was the barge crew. The barge was from Louisiana, from the oil fields, and it was really interesting. When I tell you that all these guys were heroes, it was amazing. The average age of the Navy dive team was probably 26 or 28, something like that. The average age of the barge team was like 56 or maybe 60, something along those lines. And this team came together like this. It was amazing. When you have a goal that's this important, that's this exciting, the team just comes together. These gentlemen were true patriots, and they were just as much involved in making this happen as the Navy team was. Now, we had some language issues going on here. Has anybody ever been to Louisiana and had to decipher that dialect? There were some real language issues going on, especially the crane operator. I don't have a picture of him here, but I have a picture of him, another picture of him later. His name was Bobbie, and he was the crane operator. Thank goodness we do crane operations with hand signals because the dialect was a little bit rough. But I have to tell you, the cooks on board were from Louisiana too, and we ate so well for 45 days. It was incredible. Thank goodness we were working very hard and exercising a lot. So we had two types of diving. 45 days to get this done is not a lot of time. We had a lot of work to do. We had to get a lot of bottom hours. That's what we call the amount of time we spend on the bottom, down at depth, to get this done. And so we had two types of diving going on in order to maximize how much time the divers could spend on the bottom. So the first type of diving that I'm going to talk about is saturation diving. And with saturation diving, this is where, this is a very specialized technical diving, and this is where the divers are staying at pressure for long periods of time, for the whole time that they are operating. And so their system is saturated to depth, to pressure. We saturated the divers to about 220 feet, not the 240. So we had to rent a saturation system. The Navy did not have a portable saturation system. I must tell you that this was 2002. Now in 2014, the Navy actually, because of this operation, the Navy now has a portable saturation system that they use for deep ocean operations. Because we did the proof of concept on this operation, we now have one that's located San Diego, either Panama City, Florida, or San Diego, one of those two places. Only one system though. We rented this from Global Marine. We had to do some work to it to bring it up to our standards. It was a system they used for oil field operations, and we had to bring it up to our standards. Basically, it has a control van. It had two chambers. These chambers were sitting on the barge, and the chambers were chambers that you could pressurize to the depth of water that we wanted to work at. And so the divers were put into the chamber, and they were brought to the pressure that we want them to work at on the bottom of the, down at the bottom where the monitor is. Once they're pressurized, then we had 4 divers in a team. 2 of those divers, the first team would go into the personal transfer chamber, or the ball, the diving bell, and that first team would go down and go to work. 1 diver would stay in the bell, the other diver would go to work on monitor. The second diver would be in the bell as standby diver. The first diver would go to work for 6 hours, or for 3 hours. His buddy would be in the bell for 3 hours, and then they would trade places, and that would happen for 6 hours. Then they would come back up in their little elevator or their little bell, and that bell would marry onto the chamber, and that team would come out, and then the next team of 2 divers would go in, and they would go to work for 6 hours. And this would go on for 24 hours a day. And they could stay pressurized for a week to 10 days, depending on how their health was doing. And we had diving medical officers specialized in saturation working with us on the barge to keep an eye on these saturation divers. So in this, you can see there's the control van. You can see that's one of the, down in the right-hand corner, you can see that's the chamber on the barge where they lived for a week to 10 days. And there's the 4-man dive team. 2 of them would be working for 6 hours, and 2 of them would be in there. And then there you can see 2 of them would get into the bell, and then they would go to work. 1 would stay in the bell for 3 hours while the other one went to work for 3 hours. And then they'd come back up, and they'd get out, and then the next 2-man team. And then they do that for a week to 10 days. And we could do that for 24 hours. And then when that team was done, they would go into the other chamber that was on the barge, and they would have to decompress for 66 hours before they could come out into atmospheric pressure, or into sea level. And while they were decompressing for 66 hours, then another 4-man team had already gone in and was getting to work. So we could run saturation operations almost constantly. And that gave us a lot of time working on monitor. With 1 diver, 1 saturation diver could be working on monitor almost constantly. And this bell could be lowered in almost any weather conditions. So that 1 diver could work in almost any weather conditions almost nonstop, and you can see. But 1 diver cannot work by himself doing a lot of the work that we needed to do. So we also had the mixed gas divers, and these are divers that we utilize doing almost all of our Navy operations. We use a lot of scuba divers, and we use a lot of other gas divers doing a lot of our Navy work. But mixed gas divers are kind of our bread and butter. Hard hat divers are our bread and butter diving operations. And in this case, when we go deep, for both the saturation and the mixed gas divers, when we're going deep, we don't breathe air. We breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen. That helps to make sure we don't get nitrogen narcosis. And that's all stuff that you learn about in physics and in oceanography and in engineering. But so that's why we breathe helium and oxygen. And what does breathing helium make our voices sound like? Mickey Mouse, yes. So it does take a little bit, it does make communications with the surface a little bit interesting. So the mixed gas dive teams put down 2 divers at a time, and then the 3rd diver stays up on the barge, and they're our standby emergency diver. And these divers can go down 2 divers at a time, but they're limited. They can only go down for 30 or 40 minutes of work on the bottom, and they go down on that open stage. So we're limited by sea conditions of, sometimes we couldn't put the mixed gas divers in the water when the sea conditions were not favorable. So the mixed gas, the saturation diver was maybe down there working, but we couldn't get his help down there to help him with some of the jobs. But once those guys are down there for 30 or 40 minutes maximum, we have to bring them up. We do approximately an hour of in-water decompression as they come up on the stage. They have 5 minutes of surface interval as we get them out of their dive suit and their dive equipment. So it's kind of like, how many have seen the NASCAR race pit stop, you know, when things are flying? It's a little bit like that, because we have 5 minutes to get them all undressed out of their helmet and back in a recompression chamber on this barge, and back into the chamber and down to a depth. And then we have another basically hour and 15 minutes in the chamber to finish their decompression. So we have a different chamber for the mixed gas divers. And we actually had 2 chambers for them. So we could be running the decompression for these divers and then still put another 2-man team of mixed gas divers in the water down to help do the job with the saturation divers. So we were trying to run these guys we had to wait the hour to get them out of the water, and then we could send another 2-man team down. Because there was a lot of work to do down there, and sometimes it took all 3 divers to do the job. Now you noticed on the divers that you can see here that this very small guy with a really small arm there, Master Diver Fred Orns, he actually used to play football, pro football, before he came into the Navy as a diver. You can see he's checking the diver's helmet there. That helmet has not only communications with the surface, it has a very bright light on it, and it has the camera I was talking to you about. So everybody on the barge sees what the diver sees. And a very strong camera, communications with the people on the barge, so we're watching everything. But the next team of divers are also watching what that diver's doing. So the next team knows what they're doing, and they're watching so that they can go right back down and see what that diver was doing. So what did we need to do? The first thing we needed to do was to clear that armor belt. Remember, the Monitor had flipped over when it sank, flipped over, it was upside down, and it had fallen on top of the turret. And you can see the turret peeking out underneath the aft end of the Monitor. So we had to cut off that armor belt, and that armor belt was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was protecting the ship and the turret. And I like to say that that armor belt was kind of like the first composite material ever made. That armor belt was 1 ton per linear foot. And it was actually made out of 3x5 wood composite and iron beams, all meshed together with 5 1-inch thick armor plates in front of it. So we had to cut through that. And of course it had been in salt water for over 140 years. We had to cut through that. We had tested some cutting devices before we went out there. We were using some Broco cutting torches. We had used hydroblasters to try to cut through the wood beams. And we were working and trying to get through that. And we had a timeline, of course, that we had developed to try to make sure we would stay on schedule. And we were getting way behind schedule. And you could see that there in the picture, we were had that little gash through there. Originally, we were going to cut 2 pieces and lift it up, but we were so behind schedule that we were just making 1 cut. And finally, we had enginemen out there, we had hull technicians who are experts in cutting and welding. Finally, we had a bosun mate chief who came up with the great idea. Let's run a wire strap through there and take it up to the barge to a sling and just run it back and forth like a cutting knife, and just keep running it back and forth and cut right through it with the wire sling. And that's how we finally got through it. And so we took a day off on the 4th of July, and then on the 5th of July we ran the wire sling through it and finally finished the cut on July 5th. And you can see there that we ended up just making the 1 cut, using the crane to lift that piece off, and ended up setting that piece there of the stern off to the side. And it's still sitting on the bottom of the ocean right now, waiting for someday to go back down and cut a little piece of the armor belt off, a little chunk off that we can deliver to the museum. And on July 5th. So now we finally have exposed the turret, and you can see a picture there of one of the underwater photographers, and that shows you the size of the armor belt and the size of the turret compared to one of the divers. So now it's July 5th. We're a little bit behind schedule, and we still have a lot of work to do, because phase 2 is we need to excavate the area around the turret so we can set down the lifting device to pick up the turret. Because remember, the turret's been down there 150 years, and the turret is like a soda can. It's setting down there. We don't know how good a shape it's in. It's in salt water. We need to pick it up, but we don't want to crush it when we pick it up. We don't want it to fall apart. We need to pick it up. So all those smart engineers that work for me, because I'm not an engineer, all those smart engineers that are working for me and our salvage company have to come up with a way to pick it up. So they designed this very unique lifting device, which we call a spider for obvious reasons. And we're going to lower this spider on it. We're going to close the spider legs up underneath it and then lift it up. But the turret is buried about halfway in the sand. So we have to excavate the sand out from around it so we can get the spider down under it. And the engineers tell me we have to excavate the stuff that's inside of it to make it light enough to pick up. Because the crane on the barge will lift 500 tons, but we need to lighten that up so that we have a safety factor to get that thing light enough to lift up. And we have to reinforce the roof of the turret, because remember, it fell over upside down. So the roof of the turret is what's underneath, and it was never designed to hold any weight. So we have to reinforce under that. So the divers have to get to work. They have to excavate around the turret using hydroblasters, and that's a really, really powerful hydroblaster. The divers loved working with that. But remember, this is also an archaeological dig. So we had to use eductors, which would suck the sand and silt up into a wire basket. And we'd take that sand and we'd bring it up to the surface, and we'd quickly turn it over to NOAA and the museum, the Mariners Museum, and let the archaeologists and historians go through all that stuff, looking for artifacts. They found amazing artifacts: rings, buttons, spoons, just beautiful things that are on display, and just wonderful things. We finally were able to adduct around it enough, and then we had to move inside the turret and start blasting away. Unfortunately, when the ship tipped over, a lot of coal fell inside the turret because it slid underneath a coal bunker, and that coal hardened. So it was very hard getting, it wasn't just sand and silt inside of the turret. We were so happy the day that in the middle of the night, one of the chiefs called up in his little Mickey Mouse voice and said, "I found the guns." We did not know for sure that those Dahlgren guns were inside there with the carriages. Nobody had seen them in. And when we found those, it was a day to celebrate, a night to celebrate. The other thing that we celebrated about was we found the remains of 2 sailors in the turret. And it still gives me goosebumps when I say that. We did have on board with us, we had a representative from the SILHI, which is the joint headquarters for Central Identification Lab, who are the experts for recovering missing in action, military missing in action soldiers and sailors. We stopped all salvage operations, and we went through the protocols to recover the remains of those 2 sailors and turn them over to the gentleman from the Central Identification Lab, and he flew those to Hawaii and turned them over to Hawaii, and those are the 2 sailors that were buried in Arlington Cemetery. And we had to stop everything for a period of a couple days, but that's okay, because that's what we were there for, and that was important. And then once that was over, we went back to our plan, and were able to get most of the debris out. We left the cannons and the carriages inside, and we just rigged them to the frame. And then we were able to get the spider in place, and it was hydraulics, so the divers were able to get the hydraulics underneath the lip of the turret, which was such a clever, I tell you, you engineers are so darn clever. If we can use hydraulics instead of sailor power, that is fabulous. Thank you very much for you engineers. But you can see the divers there working the hydraulics and closing the feet. Although the engineers told me that we only needed like 3 out of the 8 feet touching underneath, and I said, oh, I don't think so. I want all those feet underneath there before we lift that up, because I am not going to be known as the captain who dropped the turret back down. So we had all the feet underneath there. And then, of course, it could happen, and this goes out to my oceanographic buddies. It was the weekend, it was a Saturday, and one of the historians said, we need to reinforce that roof better. And the divers are like, no, no, it's fine. And Dr. Broadwater and I conferred, and we said, we need to reinforce the roof better, because we do not want the roof breaking and everything, like the guns and all those artifacts, falling out of the bottom, because we don't want to lose any of those artifacts. There could be more sailors in there. There could be anything in there. We do not want that roof falling. So on Saturday, we sent the divers back down. There were a few choice words, because, you know, divers do that. And there were some other threats made. But we went back to work Saturday, and this was the kind of weather that was approaching us, because it was August 3rd, and the hurricane season was coming upon us. But we needed to do this right, because we didn't have a second chance. This is the kind of operation, military operations are like that. You don't have a second chance. You have to do it right. But you have to make decisions also when you're a military commander. You know, you have to collect all the information. You have to talk to all your experts, especially those master chiefs. And then you have to start making some decisions, and they're not easy decisions. And then sometimes you have other factors to take into account. We had to make that roof better. So we went in, you know, I talked to the chiefs. Chiefs, how do we shore up that roof? They came up with a great plan. They shored up the roof. That was Saturday. Sunday, we had every VIP on the East Coast showed up on Sunday. Were you there on Sunday? We had admirals, I think we had some senators, I don't know. We had every VIP on the East Coast there on Sunday, because we were ready to make the lift on Sunday. The weather looked like this. And we had some parameters that we knew that we needed to follow before we could put that crane hook in the water and lift this out of 240 feet of depth. Because that crane hook could only work at a certain, the barge would move. The barge would rock, and we didn't, that crane hook would swing. So John Broadwater and I put our heads together. Some of the Navy folks were saying, do it. The barge crew was saying, we'll do whatever you tell us to do. And we had a lot of people. We had helicopters in the air, and we had a lot of people there that wanted to see this historic moment. But the other big consideration is safety of the divers. And that's something, you know, I could live with dropping the turret back in the water. I couldn't live with injuring one of my sailors. So I actually got a phone call from an admiral who was on the beach, who I didn't know, Admiral Cohen. He had been invited down, not by myself or the Navy, he had been invited down by somebody else to watch this operation. I subsequently met him a couple years later. Wonderful, wonderful man. And he called me up, and he said, at the time I was commander, Commander Scholley, this is Admiral Cohen, he said, listen, don't you worry about any of us. You're the person out there on the scene. You know what needs to be done. You make this decision based on what you know and based on what you think. And don't you worry a thing about the rest of us. And Dr. Broadwater looked at me and he said, you know, it's your call. And then I turned to my master chief, Scott Heineman. You guys know Scott Heineman. And you know, I talked through a couple things with him, and I said, we're not doing it. We're not doing it. It's just the conditions are not right. So we sent all the VIPs home on Sunday. And then, unfortunately, we were running out of, we knew that there was a huge storm coming on Tuesday. And we were also running out of money because we only had so much money. So Monday morning we got up, and John and I ran out at first light, and we looked at the weather. And the weather had settled down a little bit. And it doesn't look like it on this picture, but the weather, the current was still bad. So we decided to take it one step at a time on Monday morning. Everybody was gone, of course, so it wasn't too bad. We still had media on board the barge, so it was still being properly documented that if we dropped it, you know, it would still be documented. And my career would be, you know, but that's okay. We decided to do it one step at a time. We had already put this stabbing guide device down earlier. That was already in the water. We lifted the hook up. We put it in the water. We put a saturation diver, Chief Nelson, in the water. He had to hook up the lifting slings, the 8 legs of the lifting slings. It took him, was supposed to take him 6 hours. It took him like 2, although he used every single of the 6 or 8 words that you can't say on TV. He used those a lot in his Mickey Mouse voice, but he did it in 2 hours, so you know, it was fabulous. But it was very funny to listen to. And at about 6 o'clock that evening, on Monday evening, we brought the turret up to the surface, and it looked really good, and it didn't crumble on us, so it was very successful, and there was a huge cheer. And the benefits was we really got a lot of great training out of this. We trained divers from all over the Navy. We brought divers in from commands from all over the Navy. We improved a lot of diving techniques, especially in saturation diving and mixed gas diving, a lot of tools, a lot of equipment techniques. But we also supported history. And this is, the turret and the steam engine are down in the Mariners Museum. You can see it right there. It was a big ceremony when it was moved to the Mariners Museum, and the shipyard down there built the tanks that they're being conserved in, and it's an ongoing process. It's a tremendous educational opportunity just watching the whole process of the conservation, and there's a beautiful monitor center. You can see it there down at the Mariners Museum, but it's a fabulous learning of history, science, engineering. It just covers everything, the whole story. The display is just fabulous for school kids. But it's a story that tells about our naval heritage. And any of you who have walked the battlefields of Gettysburg, and you get the goosebumps, I've done that when I went to ICAF and walked Gettysburg. But when I walked on the Monitor's decks, when I had 19 dives on Monitor, I got the same goosebumps as walking the battlefield of Gettysburg. But it was better because I'm a naval officer and I walked on Monitor. Anyway, thank you very much. There's a quote from the surgeon: "As long as we remain a people, so long will the work of Monitor be remembered." And that is absolutely true. Those are the documentaries from those film crews that were there that had me mic'd the whole time so I couldn't say any of those words that you can't say on TV. And then the books. Paul Clancy wrote a fabulous book about the 2002 expedition, and he didn't quote any of those bad words that I said. But that's a great book that, that tells about our story out there in 2002. And there's a kids' edition of it, which is so cool. I didn't know about it, but my kids know about it. And everybody knows about challenge coins. We had challenge coins made up for all the divers that dove on, and we took them down on Monitor. Master Diver Heineman and I took them down on Monitor, and then brought them straight back up. So we all the divers have a challenge coins that touch the Monitor. Thank you very much. You are an awesome audience. Good luck to you, midshipmen.